when we talk about this figurative language idea, I'm going to go back to our central metaphor, figurative language, I know. We have said that as this book progresses chapter by chapter, we become more abstract in meaning. We kind of ascend language mountain. If we consider ground level of language mountain to be literal meaning, each progressive step moves us further away from saying exactly what we intend. And our chapters over figurative meaning have become more complex. We started with simple figurative language, metaphors. We moved up to talking about symbols. And now here in this chapter, you see we're talking about paradox, overstatement, understatement, and irony. With all three of these, or all four of these, we are talking about situations where we're not always saying exactly what we're saying. And it changes slightly with each. We can do this one of two ways. I will let you decide how you'd like to work. Way one has you read the whole chapter on your own, and then we come back together to discuss. Way two, read and then we discuss, or way two, we work through it together bit by bit. I see enough twos that we're going to go two. All right. Let's start on that first page and look at paradoxes. If you take a look at the definition that they give you here in the book, they tell you that, a paradox is an apparent contradiction that is nevertheless somehow true. And your brain just kind of short circuits because you go, wait, what does that even mean? Like, how does that work? Let me give you some examples of paradoxes. If we were to say a phrase like, if I know anything, it's that I know nothing. Your brain might go a little bit like, wait, how can you know no? But if you know something, then you don't know nothing. But is there a logic to that statement? It seems contradictory that to say that if you know anything, it's that you know nothing. But if you ask any man, they will go, that is the best statement I've ever heard in my life. Because anytime a woman asks a question, that's your best answer that you can give. When they're like, what's your opinion on this? Just look and go, I have no opinion. I know nothing. It's the best way. It keeps you from getting into trouble. Except sometimes you do. Let me give you another example of a paradoxical phrase. If somebody looked at you and said, you know what, deep down, you're really shallow. You're going, wait, shallow, deep? But your brain starts to go, no, that works perfectly fine. Leave it alone. Stop it. A paradoxical phrase is really effective because of the shock value, because of that initial blip that your brain does to try to process it before it goes, I see what you're doing there. We had one yesterday in the reading. As Hamlet is talking to his mother, he says to her, I must be cruel to be kind. And you go, oh, okay, yeah. There's, of course, one of the most famous paradoxical phrases that has ever been given. Bernard Shaw said years ago, George Bernard Shaw, what a pity that youth must be wasted on the young. And so these phrases have a similarity to something that you probably know really well. What's an oxymoron? Yes, an oxymoron is a figure of speech where two words present a contradiction. Can you tell me the easiest oxymoron that you often learn really quickly? And your brain goes, no, I remember. I got that. Now, these are similar to paradoxes, except the purpose of an oxymoron is simply that figure of speech to present the contradiction. That's all. There's no, though this might be true, there is no truth that is found in it. There's not that contradictory nature that reveals something. That shock value isn't present. And so when we talk about them, paradoxes usually unfold. There's a little bit of unpacking you have to do versus this. You're just like, yeah, cute. Let's look at a poem that kind of persists on the purpose of a paradox, and it's by Emily Dickinson. And again, we're going to use Hamlet as a way to explore this. Remember, with Dickinson's poetry, her titles are derived from the first line of the poem. So we don't always get a whole lot out of the title. But here she says, much madness in divinest sense to a discerning eye, or much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense, the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent, and you're sane. Demure, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. Take a second to look at the poem again and see if you can express the paradox in your own words. And kind of think about Hamlet in doing that, because it might help you. Anybody want to give it a shot to explain the paradox? Maybe let's start with the contradictory notions that we're playing with. What are the two phrases or ideas that kind of exist on opposite ends of the spectrum that she's leaning into? Madness and sense. So if we look at the first line, she says, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Okay, so let's relate this to Hamlet. Hamlet's plan in the early parts of the play is to do what to find truth? Yeah, put on that antic disposition, fake madness. When we examined Act 2 and Act 3 as he puts on that madness, we often found that what he's doing is creating humor if you know how to read through it. And so when we look, much madness was divinest sense. His apparent madness had a truth to it if you know how to look for it with that discerning eye. Then you look at how she presents the opposite in the next lines. Much sense, the starkest madness. Are there times that people tell you something that is perfectly sensible and it's the right answer, but it doesn't make sense? I mean, you might not be able to think one off the top of your head, but a lot of times, especially as a younger person, it comes across in the ways that you might be treated or the ways that people approach how they're going to handle a situation where they understand that you're an adult, but they don't give you the full freedoms of adulthood. And you're like, this is crazy. Like either you're going to let me be an adult or you're not. Why am I trapped in this middle zone? So she presents both sides of it. And though she's counterbalancing these two ideas, you're seeing the logic in what she's doing. But she explores why this happens. Who does she say determines madness and sense?
Is it the majority?
The majority. One of the easiest ways that we can talk about the use of the word crazy, if we want to keep it there, is in how people dress. Why would we look at the way someone's dressed and call it crazy? Likely. Huh? Oh, I thought you were going to say something.
I was going to say it doesn't fit everyone else's.
Exactly. It doesn't fit the majority. The majority has determined what's appropriate, what you should wear. And if you exist outside of that, well, then you're seen as different. So they followed up. Assent, and you're sane. Give in to the majority, you're good. Demure, go against it. You're you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain, locked up. And here you're going, ooh, I like that. There's a lot of power to that. Think about how that works with Hamlet. Go along with the plan, pretend to fit in. Hey man, you can stay. You can be a part of our kingdom. You go against it, you call me out. You're going to England in Act 4, pal. And you're not coming back. And so we see that Dickinson is exploring this, and she's exploring the paradox of it. How is it that people can determine whether you're viewed as sane or crazy? Consider, even if you look at the years that Dickinson is writing, up to 1886, roughly 1886, if we want to like ballpark it there, women were seen as mad sometimes after childbirth if they were dealing with postpartum depression, something they didn't understand at the time. The cure at the time for postpartum depression was to put women in a room and tell them to rest. If you know anyone that is depressed, is that a good idea? No, that's about the opposite of what you should do. But they thought that what was the problem is that these women's brains were just going too fast. So put them in a room, tell them to rest, don't let them read, don't let them work, don't let them do anything. And eventually they'll cure. This rest cure was terrible. If you take a look, there is a short story you may have come across, you may not have, titled The Yellow Wallpaper. It is based on this woman's experience with having been in this rest cure. But in the story, she elaborates it and goes over to talk about how she loses her, the protagonist in it loses her mind. She thinks that the wallpaper is coming to life and that there's a lady behind it that like sneaks out and comes back. It is fascinating when you look at it, but it's a great example of what Dickinson was seeing. At the time, the majority decide whether you are sane or there, even though sometimes we see perfect sense in madness and perfect madness in sense. So when we look at paradoxes, it's that shock value. It's presenting the contradiction in a way to get your attention and then using it as a way to explore further meaning. If you take a look below that poem, we get into overstatement and understatement. Now, these are really simple terms, but they're often a little bit more difficult when we talk about effect. So if you look at overstatement, overstatement's also known as a hyperbole. It's a simple exaggeration, but an exaggeration in the service of truth. When we get to hyperbole, that's usually a gross over-exaggeration. We're going way far with it. If you have trouble with overstatements or with hyperbole, the best way that you can connect that definition is to think about yo mama jokes. Every yo mama joke in existence is based on hyperbole. No one's mother is so fat that she needs to use a boomerang to get dressed in the morning. Put your belt on. Whoa. You don't know that one? No one's mother is so fat that she has, she actually occupies all the space in her house when she sits down. It doesn't happen. Your mama's so fat when she sits around the house, she sits around the house. Anyway, it's not working today. Think about that. Those yo mama jokes, great examples of hyperbole. On the other side of it, we have the understatement. This one's a little bit more, not just demure, but difficult to see. It's where you're saying less than what you mean. It may exist in what one says or in how you say it. So there's a lot of nuance to that. Think about the guy that sits down at a buffet and says, "This looks like a nice snack." Obviously, it's much more than a snack that's presented. And in qualifying it as such a small thing, he's making the point about it. He's trying to bring it in for effect. We're going to take a look at this John Donne poem that is here, titled The Sun Rising, as a way just simply to look at the use of overstatement. We're not going to focus on understatement. We're just going to look at overstatement. We all know the sun. We got it. Here, look for the opportunities where he expands or kind of goes too far with what he wants. Busy old fool, unruly son, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us? Must to thy motions lovers' seasons run? Saucy, pedantic wretch, go chide late schoolboys and sour apprentices. Go tell court huntsmen that the king will ride. Call country ants to harvest offices. Love, all alike, no season knows, nor clime, nor hours, days, months, which are the rags of time. Thy beams so reverend and strong, why shouldst thou think I could eclipse and cloud them with a wink? But that I would not lose her sight so long, If her eyes have not blinded thine, look, and tomorrow late tell me whether both the Indies and of spice and mine be where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. Ask for those kings whom thou saw'st yesterday, and thou shalt hear, all here in one bed lay. She's all states, and all princes I, nothing else is. Princes do but play us, compared to this. All honors mimic, all wealth alchemy. Thou, son, art half as happy as we, and that the world's contracted thus. Thine age asks ease, and since thy duties be to warm the world, that's done in warming us. Shine here to us, and thou art everywhere. This bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere. Okay, he's talking about the sun the whole time. We get it. But look at a phrase like what we have towards line 9 and 10. Remember, we want to exaggerate. We want to overstate. And here we're talking about the sun rising, about the idea of the importance of the sun. Look at lines 9 and 10. Anybody feel like they can explain how this overstates or creates hyperbole? Like climate.
Oh. Is he talking about how the sun, no matter what's happening, always rises? Yeah.
That's part of what we have here to it. And he's trying to, if you want to think about understatement in that first stanza especially, he's trying to like make it like, leave me alone. Go bother boys that are late to school. Go bother this or that. Think about what we have mentioned here in these lines, especially, you asked about seasons, climate, and then in the next line, hours, days, months. How are all of those things created or measured? Through the sun, right? But does the sun know that? Like, it's kind of that weird thing. You think sometimes when you come back to it and you go, how did we end up with 24 hours in the day? And it's like an hour is a constructed thing. We just kind of made it up. We figured out roughly, okay, it takes about that long. I don't know. How many you want? 24? Sure, why not? Let's go that way. Think about all these constructs that are there that we've built around it. Climate, for example. Yeah, 100%. There's a difference between rain and sun. There's a difference between today like today where it's just like blah, and a day that's beautiful. Sun doesn't know the difference. It's just there. It doesn't know that it's creating it or impacting it or doing it. It's just there. And so we kind of overstate this ideal, these man-made things that it's like, oh, well, at the end of it, they're the rags of time. It's inconsequential, but it isn't at the same time. We notice that we keep elevating. And then by the time we get to the second stanza, who's he comparing the sun to? This is really where we get to that idea of like the big overstatement. See, look at line 13, for example, right? I could eclipse and cloud thee with a wink. So if we've overstated the importance of the sun, how great it is and all that stuff, and we seem to understate it by like, leave me alone. Like, how can we singularly like kill the influence of the sun? Yeah, you close your eyes. So he has that little bit. Think about when you were a kid and you came up with that idea of like, oh, I could pinch your head. It's that same thing. Like, you think you're so powerful? You think you have so much control? Watch. So he says, I could eclipse and cloud them with a wink, but that I would not lose her sight so long. Her, a love. If her eyes have not blinded thine, look and tomorrow. That concept of like, The sun can blind me, but how can I stop it? I just don't look at it. But I can't not look at her. And maybe if she's looked at the sun, she's blinded the sun in the same way the sun could blind me. It's that over romantic, overstatement of her importance. And we see it continue. Notice when he talks about checking in with kings and seeing treasures, he focuses back to my treasure is in my bed next to me. The sun might find it somewhere else, but this is mine. Oh my gosh. Becomes a love poem. It starts off with this simple reflection of the sun being too much and then becomes this whole lovesick boy. Overstatement. We create this gross over-exaggeration of not just the influence of the sun and all that and the understatement, but then to go as far as to say the woman is even more important. Everybody got it? We don't need to spend a ton of time there. Next, we're going to come to irony. Oh boy. How many of you feel like you struggle with irony? Someone who's honest. Thank you. So when we look at irony, it is a complex word with a super simple definition. For something to be ironic, it simply means that the expected does not happen. That's it. That's the whole definition. I'd like to play a video rather than trying to explain first. I think visually this video does a really good job of presenting what do we mean when we talk about situational irony. And if we understand situational irony, verbal irony is simple. Grammarly.
You are. With Grammarly on your computer and
Picture this. Your friend and you are watching a sitcom, and the sassy sidekick walks into a room carrying a 4-tiered wedding cake. He trips, falls, and face plants into the cake. Your friend doubles over with laughter and says, "So ridiculous! So ironic!" Oh, quick, what do? Do you laugh along with the laugh track and let this grievous misinterpretation of irony go? Or do you throw caution to the wind and explain the true meaning of irony? If you're me, you choose the latter. Unfortunately, irony has been completely misunderstood. We tend to throw out that term whenever we see something funny or coincidental. And while many examples of true irony can be funny, that is not the driving factor of being ironic. A situation is only ironic if what happens is the exact opposite of what was expected. If you expect A, but get B, then you have irony. Let's take the slapstick cake situation as an example. When someone walks in, precariously balancing something that shouldn't be carried alone, trips, falls, and makes a mess, it is funny, but it's not ironic. In fact, you probably expect someone who is single-handedly carrying a huge cake to trip. When he does, reality aligns with expectations, and so that is not irony. But what if the sassy sidekick walked in wearing a gold medal that he'd won at the cakewalking event at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996? What if that sidekick was a professional cake carrier? Then, maybe there would have been a reasonable expectation that he would have been more skilled when carrying a ridiculously large cake. Then, when that reasonable expectation was not met by the tripping sidekick, irony would have been exemplified. Another example. A senior citizen texting and blogging. The common and reasonable expectation of more mature men and women is that they don't like or know technology, that they have a hard time turning on a computer, or that they have the old brick cell phones from the 1980s. One should not expect them to be connected, high-tech, or savvy enough to text or to be blogging, which must seem like some sort of newfangled thing that back in my day, they never had. So when Granny pulls out her smartphone to post pictures of her dentures or her grandkids, irony ensues. Reasonable expectations of the situation are not met. That is irony. So while the cake dropper might not be ironic, there are all kinds of situations in life that are. Go out and find those true examples of irony.
I just like because it illustrates it clearly with the difference between expectation and reality. And that's often where people get tripped up with the term, is when it's something that just happens and might be situational. They're like, oh, it's man, no. Or if it's coincidental, and they're like, man, that's ironic. No, it's not. For example, the two women that were dressed alike in the cartoon, that just happened. That's a coincidence. There's nothing ironic about it. I want to illustrate irony in poetry by using one that's in your book, but it's not in, if anybody's following us at home, it's not in their book. So I'm going to put it up here so that they can see it. And I want to talk about One Perfect Rose. So it's a modern 20th century poem by a woman. Who would think? It's very easily grasped. This one is exactly what it should be to help to show irony. So if you take a look at the poem itself, this is on 664. A single flower he sent me since we met. All tenderly his messenger he chose. Deep-hearted, pure, with scented dew still wet. One perfect rose. I knew the language of the floweret. My fragile leaves, it said, his heart enclose. Love long has taken for his amulet. One perfect rose. Why is it no one ever sent me yet one perfect limousine, do you suppose? Oh, no. So it's just my luck to get one perfect rose. Can anybody talk about the irony in the poem?
In the poem, or through the title on the first two stanzas, you're expecting her to, oh, I love my rose. I'm so thankful for it. But then in the third stanza, she turns around and says, well, why isn't someone giving me a limousine?
Exactly. We're a girl-heavy class. Even Jared will include you here. If you have somebody that you love and they show up with a rose, you gonna be happy? If they're like, it's your birthday, and you're like, great, it's my birthday, celebrate me, and they decide to show up with a rose and say, I love you for the first time, you're gonna be like, that's all the present I needed. Oh, thank you for being honest. You know you're not going to be happy. You know you're going to look at them like, you cheap ass. Where's my real gift? 100%. She presents it here. And notice how she plays a game. The first two stanzas have a more classical tone to them. But then notice how by the time we get to the third stanza, it becomes more conversational. She changes her diction just slightly to help to elevate that and to give us that sense. And so when we look at that irony here, expected is not what we get. Now, verbal irony is similar. If you flip back on the previous page on 663 and you look at the definition of verbal irony is simply, saying the opposite of what you mean. And so a lot of times people are like, that's it. You say something out loud, but you really intend it to be something different. Look outside. What great weather we're having today. It's so pretty. Now, context allows us to understand that as verbal irony. Because could those statements be complementary? Absolutely. Context is important when looking at irony too. We need to have that situationally set up so that we get that bit of verbal irony to it. Think about how they describe the cake carrying thing in there. If I saw a guy running on a track and I said, wow, what a great athlete. If he's the only guy on the track, that could be complimentary. But if he's 15 feet behind the whole pack as they're all running around the track, then you get what I'm doing here. Now you notice that your text also introduces sarcasm to the mix. Let's talk about those two words. Because sometimes these two get mixed, and sometimes we don't have a really great idea of what we mean when we say sarcasm. To describe something as sarcastic comes from the Greek. It means to tear flesh. If you are being sarcastic, you are intending to add a a tone of hurt and anger, of bitterness, you want to inflict some damage, even if it's slight and mocking. You want to do that. That's why when students are like, Mr. Walsh, you're so sarcastic, I'm always like, no, I'm not. I'm facetious. To be facetious is to simply be silly for the purpose of humor. If I was being sarcastic, I would be out to hurt you, and that's not my point at all. Yes, a little bit of verbal irony. But anyway, if we look at here, you can make a statement that is verbal irony that does not have an end of sarcasm to it. I don't want you to think that all verbal irony is sarcasm. No, you can point out something and say the opposite without necessarily being hurtful or having a bitterness to it. And so it's important that we see that these two things can be separate. Let's put this into practice with a poem. If you flip a couple of pages forward, we're going to look at Ozymandias. This is a classic piece by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Of course, if you're like Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband. If you know Frankenstein, that's Mary Shelley. Her husband was more famous than she was. Here with Ozymandias, if you just look at it and you take a look at the structure of it, what are some things you notice?
It's not structured in stanzas.
It's one stanza. How many lines is it? 14 lines. What shape does it kind of look like if I put it on one page instead of splitting it between two? Kind of sort of looks squarish. This is a sonnet. So we know that sonnets have certain characteristics to them. We know that we can find meaning if we can figure out what type of sonnet it is. Take a look at the last two lines. Do they rhyme? No. Because they don't, we can guess that this is probably an Italian sonnet, meaning we want to pay attention to line 9. Italian sonnets are structured into two parts: an octave, the first 8 lines, and a sestet, the last 6 lines. So when we look, a lot of times we can get that meaning there and kind of pay attention. So let's take a look at this poem. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Anybody feel like they can explain the irony just after a first read? Okay, I'm going to show you something that might help a little bit. There's a cool website that I found years ago. Well, I find it cool. You probably like, Mr. Walsh, this is not cool. And the guy who runs the website, he's an illustrator. He literally illustrates poems. And so he'll take it and like do a little comic strip to kind of walk it through and create a visual. So here's his comic strip for this poem. okay with a visual? Anybody feel like they can at least start to try to explain the irony? Go ahead.
So in it, he's describing finding like the wreckage or the what's left of a large monument of a king. And this king is very proud of himself, and he was like, I am the king of all kings. I am the mighty one, the great one. But when it's found later, it's literally there's nothing around him that he's in charge of, and his sculpture is broken.
Yeah, so if you're looking, there's that central irony to it. This idea of like the words that are stamped on the pedestal to be remembered forever don't represent what this traveler finds around him. All that he sees is a broken statue. All that he sees around is this wasteland. Anybody have a further irony that they might see?
Yeah, he says he's king of all kings, but they're so easily forgotten.
Exactly. To proclaim such huge power, but not only are his works, as he says, look on my works in despair. Well, there's nothing there. But I'm so great, I'm a legend. It's been forgotten. Think about the fact that at the top they say that the only way that we know this story is from an incident that happened with a traveler from an ancient land, a land that itself was forgotten. And so it's almost like an ancient king that's been forgotten from a guy from a country that's been forgotten. And you just happen to hear about it, happenstance. Think about, too, the look on his face. Rather than showing a king that is glorious, a king that is happy, we show a king that is frowning. The artist took time to mock the king in his creation, and yet the king didn't notice the insult. When we look at irony, irony's difficult. Irony's way up here at the top. Oh, I got rid of language mouth, but it's way up here at the top in the clouds because it takes digging. It's not always there. We're literally saying one thing only to imply something completely different, and it takes time. But as we get into the second part of the year, we're going to talk a lot about irony. We're going to talk a lot about sarcasm. We're going to talk a lot about humor because these are those parts that the test really wants to discriminate. Can you see those to be able to get those higher scores? We're going to stop for today. If you will leave the books just here on this front table, I'll take care of them from there. Tomorrow we will